Welcome, everybody. My name is Mike Hennam. I'm excited about today's interview with John Waterbury. If you don't already follow us online, please do so. If you take any photos of today's event, you can tag us and so that we can reshare what you find most interesting. It also has the added benefit of letting your friends know about this and growing the community. It's my honor to introduce our special guest. Dr. Waterbury was the 14th president of the American University of Beirut, AUB, in January 1998 and retired from the presidency in July 2008. Before joining AUB, he was for 20 years professor of politics and international affairs at Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. He specialized in the political economy of developing countries with a special focus on the Middle East. He was a director of Princeton Center of International Studies and editor of the academic journal World Politics from 1992 to 1998. For the year 2011, he was senior advisor to the Executive Affairs Authority of Abu Dhabi on higher education. John, welcome to afikra.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
John, you are one of those people who, if I read your full bio, it would take me about 10 minutes. So what I just read is only a snippet of what you've done. But what I'd like to do is go back to 1960 and try to figure out why you landed at the American University of Cairo in 1961. What were you doing there, and why were your sights focused on the Arabic-speaking world?
Well, don't let me go on too long because it is a fairly long story, but I'll try to be brief. For reasons I can never fully explain, I decided to study Arabic when I was an undergraduate in college. That would have been about the fall of 57, sorry. And that was a random choice. I wanted to study a non-Western language. I think I suggested Chinese, but I was discouraged from doing Chinese. And somebody said, I've got a good friend who teaches Arabic. This was at Princeton. We got a good friend who teaches Arabic. He only has 3 students. You're sure to get an A in his course. So on the strength of that recommendation, I started Arabic studies, and the rest is kind of history. I don't think I fell in love with the language, but I certainly was massively intrigued by it. It turned out to be, for me, probably the most logical language I ever studied. Rules actually count in Arabic where they don't count in English. And then I decided I'd better study the region where it's spoken. And when I first started studying Arabic, I really wasn't terribly sure where Arabs lived. I had been aware of the Suez Crisis in 1956, so I knew something was going on out there, but I didn't have a good idea about that. So I started studying the Middle East politics, contemporary society in the Middle East. And then in my summer of my junior year, 1960, I actually went to Egypt. This was my first visit ever to the Middle East and to Egypt. And I spent the summer doing Arabic studies at the American University of Cairo and traveling around a good bit. And I was hooked. I mean, it was very simple. And so when I graduated the following year, I was awarded a Fulbright grant as a student to go to Egypt and continue my Arabic studies. And that is what I did.
What was Egypt like for you? I mean, 1961 and 1962 are very important years in the history of Egypt. Nasser was extremely active in those times. It was a very transformational time in Egypt's history. What was it like being there?
It was, it was all brand new for me. So absolutely astounding, I thought. I went in 1960 to do some research for my senior thesis at Princeton. We all at Princeton still have to write a senior thesis, a kind of statement that takes a good bit of time. And I did some research in the summer of 1960 on the Nasserist system in Egypt. He was on the verge, as you intimated, of announcing his so-called socialist decrees, where most of the Egyptian private sector was brought under state ownership. it was really the apogee of Nasserism. He was still the hero of the Suez War, the most heard voice in the Arab world. He was emulated by everybody from Syria to Iraq to Libya to Sudan. So massively important guy, and I was trying in my own feeble way at that point to get a handle on how he ran his show. And then I got the Fulbright after I graduated and went back and spent a year. I didn't do any research. I really just zeroed in on the language. And but of course, Egypt never rests, and the Arab world never rests. So we had plenty going on. In the fall of 1961, when I first got there, the so-called United Arab Republic, the UAR, broke apart. Syria withdrew, probably encouraged by Saudi Arabia. Some people say Saudi Arabia paid for the coup, but the UAR was dissolved, and that was the first time Nasser really had a negative punch in the face, as it were, from the rest of the Arab world. And he was angry. It was quite clear. But if I have time, I'll just give you one little anecdote. I was studying Arabic at Cairo University when the UAR broke up. I think it was actually in September 1961. So I had barely begun my visit to Egypt. And the students at Cairo University demonstrated in support of Nasser and denouncing the Infisaliyun in Syria, and denouncing Saudi Arabia and probably Washington by implication. And so it turns out that there was a rule at Cairo University that the students could, under no circumstances, demonstrate politically, even though this was in support of the regime. So they closed the university. And I had to relocate, and because my classes were suspended. I think they didn't get back into session for a couple of months. And so I transferred to the American University of Cairo to continue my Arabic studies, and that's what I did for the rest of the year.
So let's zoom down the road 30 years. So after Cairo, you go on to do a lot of things. We'll come back to some of the books and research written in that period later, but let's go to 1998, Lebanon. In 1998, as I mentioned, you became the 14th president of the American University of Beirut. You weren't living in Lebanon at the time. You actively moved to Lebanon, and this is important because you were the first president to live in Lebanon after the assassination of Malcolm Kerr, who was also the president of AUB. So walk me through the decision to move to AUB, why you were attracted to this position, and the decision to live in Lebanon.
Well, to answer that, I may have to tell a story which I don't think I've told in public, as it were, before. But I had been approached in about 1994, you can check the dates, when Bob Haddad, who had been president of AUB, resigned the presidency and went back to Northampton, where he lived. And so the presidency was vacant. And I was approached by a trustee at that time to see if I'd be interested in being a candidate for president. So I think it was about 1994. And I asked, would I be allowed to live in Beirut? Because I knew there was a travel ban and a residency ban on American passport holders, which had been put in place by the State Department. It wasn't a decision of AUB or anything like that. It was the State Department didn't want American citizens in Lebanon for fear of kidnapping and ransoming and in some instances, death. So I knew about that, and I asked the chairman of the board of trustees, would I be allowed to live in Beirut? And he said, highly unlikely. And I said, well, then I'm not interested. And I dropped out of contention, and they went through, was it Bob Haddad? I'm not sure now. May have been before Haddad. Anyhow, I had been approached, turned it down precisely because I couldn't live in Lebanon. So 4 years later, the same trustee came to see me again in Princeton and said, the presidency is opening up. Would you be interested? And I asked him the same question, would I be allowed to live in Lebanon? He said, this time I think you've got a 50-50 chance because the State Department is reconsidering the travel ban. This was when Madeleine Albright was Secretary of State. And I said, okay, if I can go and live there, I'll take it up. If I can't,
how familiar with Lebanon's as a country and as how familiar were you with the political system in Lebanon at the time?
Not sufficiently.
Well, I don't think anyone is ever sufficiently familiar.
Right. Look, Egypt with its 100 million is a simple read on its politics and its system as opposed to Lebanon. Lebanon, I learned to my dismay, is more complex than even I had imagined. In any case, just one anecdote on that. When I was living in Egypt in the 1980s, on and off, Malcolm Kerr was a frequent visitor. He supervised the UCLA students who went to Egypt on year abroad programs. So I was seeing Malcolm pretty often, and this was during the Lebanese Civil War. So I remember asking him, what the hell's going on in Lebanon? I just don't understand the animus and the nastiness and the causes of this war. And he would go through a very painstaking explanation. And I'd say to him, Malcolm, you've completely lost me. I don't understand this. You know, Lebanon is such a weird place. And he looked at me one time and said, John, mark my words, someday you're going to learn to love Lebanon. And I kind of laughed at him like, what? You out of your mind? I'm not going to go to Lebanon. And then lo and behold, I did go. I didn't know a lot. My first wife had a sister who lived in Lebanon, was married to a prominent Christian lawyer. So we visited her periodically. And I remember seeing Fairuz sing at Baalbek in something like 1966, which completely swept me away.
Yeah.
And everyone who works on the Middle East has to know Lebanon and AUB. The Lebanese diaspora is so important. At Princeton, we had Philip Hitti, among others, and his son-in-law, Bailey Winder, who taught me Arabic. So I was constantly hearing about Lebanon and knew about it just by the strength of its diaspora and the reputation of AUB. So it wasn't like Mars.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. I want to move on to some of your books. As I mentioned, you've published extensively on Morocco, on Egypt, on the entire Middle East, mostly focused on politics and economics and policy. But today's talk is going to primarily be focused on the book to the left, Mission Impossible: Higher Education and Policymaking in the Arab World. And I guess I want to talk to you specifically about, maybe a good place to start is the title, Mission Impossible. Did you know that would essentially be the title of the book before starting it? Or is that a conclusion you came to at the end saying, this is impossible. This is not going to happen. Or did you know going into it, my gut is telling me this is not going to happen. I just want to write this. This almost is like a diagnosis as to why this is not going to happen.
Well, before I answer the substance of your question, it's missions. It's plural.
Missions. Excuse me. Missions.
Yeah, and that's very important to my understanding. No, I didn't realize that was going to be the title at the beginning. It came to me, I would say, in the middle of my research. I mean, I knew what I wanted to write about. I didn't know what I wanted to call it when it was done. But I was having very much the same feelings and reaction to the data I was looking at as I had with an earlier book called Exposed to Innumerable Delusions, which was a study of public sector enterprise in 4 countries, 2 in the Middle East, Turkey and Egypt. And what had struck me in that study was how many big meta missions states assigned to public sector enterprises: generate employment, contribute to regional development, help the strategic plan move forward. build the infrastructure for their own military industrial complex, contribute to the education of citizens, vocational training, yada, yada, down a long, long list. And it meant they could never focus their resources and talent on one or two objectives that private sector enterprises are often able to do. And so I had already come to the conclusion that public sector enterprises had a kind of possible because they had so many competing missions put in front of them, often contradictory, that if you would try to achieve one, you had to sacrifice the other. And as I got into my study on higher education in the Middle East, I said that this is what I was finding with public sector enterprise. They're assigned missions from forming citizens for political systems to education for 21st century jobs to leading major research efforts, catalyzing private sector activity, you name it. It was kind of nation building all crammed into this one entity called the university. And I said, these are too many missions. They don't have the resources to fulfill even half of them. And a lot of these missions are competing. And that's where I think we may talk about the trilemma eventually, but that's where the trilemma came as a kind of analogy of the missions impossible.
So let's talk, I guess maybe let's jump to the trilemma now. And then I want to talk about how you sort of approach this book and some of the pragmatism and the realism that is dripping throughout it. But yeah, so help us understand this concept of the trilemma as it relates to higher education, institutes of higher education in the book.
Right. Well, there you've got it. The trilemma is choices among cost, quantity, and quality. That covers a lot of what any university is interested in, or a system of universities is interested in. That is to maximize the number of students who receive an education, do it at a reasonable cost, and keep up an acceptable level of quality. And my argument is that in the Arab world and just about anywhere, you can have two of those, but you can't have all three. So you've got to choose which two are most important and then sacrifice the third. So in the Arab world, the two that they worked the hardest on and succeeded pretty much in achieving was low cost and big quantity. Massification is often the term used, which I don't much like, but it is descriptive. But what got sacrificed was quality. So we've heard a constant lament, as long as I've looked at higher education in the Arab world, of mediocre and even poor quality instruction, curricula, and ultimately the quality of the graduates who are coming out, thereby contributing to the high rates of youth unemployment, educated youth unemployment in the Arab world, which is higher by far than any other region in the world.
So just as a couple clarifying questions, when you talk about the Arab world, would you describe it as being in a homogeneous space from the vantage point of higher education, institutions of higher learning? Whereas that statement you said about the two things, that the massification, essentially, low cost, high quantity, is that true across the Arab world?
No, it varies. There isn't one size fits all in the Arab world. For instance, the North African higher education system is heavily inspired by the French model, as is Lebanese University in Lebanon. And it has traditionally, up until the last decade or so, been somewhat elitist, like French higher education, the grandes écoles that you find in France. So a smaller proportion of the eligible population in North Africa has actually gone to university than you would find in what we might call the Arab heartland. And then even in the so-called Arab heartland, there's a great deal of variety. For instance, the most private education, both in terms of students and in terms of institutions, that you find in the region is in Palestine, which kind of surprised me. But Most of the universities in Palestine are private universities, which is not the case anywhere else. The public sector has always been the dominant sector, and that's what I focus on in my book. So yeah, there's a great deal of variety. And I must say in my own work, I didn't pay much attention to what I might call peripheral Arab countries like Mauritania, Somaliland, very little attention to Yemen and Oman. And I didn't focus much on the oil exporting countries because they have a very different financial proposition facing them. They've got abundant resources, and they can afford all three pieces of the trilemma. So the trilemma doesn't work very well if you're in the UAE or Kuwait or even in Bahrain. You can have quantity, quality, and very high cost because they can afford to pay for it.
So before we get into some of the policy debates, I'm curious how you approached your mandate at AUB. What was appealing about that job? What you thought the major challenges that sort of lay ahead of you? And by the end of your tenure, what did you think your mandate and sort of legacy was over that span?
Yeah, it was something of a leap into the unknown to be present. I said that I knew a fair amount secondhand and a little bit firsthand about Lebanon, but I didn't know anything about running a university. I had remarkably little administrative experience. I ran a few small programs at Princeton, but I was never even the departmental chair. So the trustees were taking a big bet on me, and I was taking a big bet on AUB. Wasn't quite sure what I was going to find. I knew by reputation that it was an extraordinary place. I mean, I had met so many people who had graduated from AUB and were on faculties throughout the United States and contributing in major ways. So I knew this place had a great track record, and that the Civil War had knocked it pretty hard, and they'd lost a lot of talent. Their finances were not in good shape, and there were a lot of internal divisions that had been brought about by the conditions of civil war, some kind of internal animosities and rivalries that were completely understandable after 15 years of bloodshed. So it was obvious to me that what my mission would be is trying to restore AUB to something like its former, I don't want to say grandeur, but its former richness and ability to lead intellectual endeavors in the Middle East. But that's easy to say. And I didn't know what the nuts and bolts were going to be at all. And I discovered pretty quickly, at least what I thought they would be, right in the first few months that I was there. And I was obliged to violate a recommendation that I had gotten from the president of Princeton University at the time. His name was Harold Shapiro. I went to Harold to say, Harold, I'm going off to Beirut to run the American University of Beirut. What would you advise me? And he said, look, don't take on too much too early. Take on a few things where you think you can score a major success or a victory, put a coonskin on the wall, and then you will establish a positive image among your constituents there, and you can move on to bigger stuff. Well, I thought that sounded like very good advice, but I got to AUB and some really big structural issues hit me right square in the face as soon as I got there, and I couldn't postpone them. So I had to take on some major issues very early on and just hope I didn't go down in flames in the process.
Were you thinking about, AUB's in crisis right now, as are most educational institutions in Lebanon, and honestly most institutions, period, in Lebanon. But were you thinking about AUB's social contract, and its relationship to Lebanon as a whole, when you're sort of taking on this undertaking? You talk about this in the book a bunch, the role that universities play in developing societies, in creating citizens and creating the labor force. Did you view it from that perspective at the time?
Yeah, I did, but that also missed a lot. Yeah, I saw AUB as some place where we could implement best practice that may have implications for the rest of society. Promotion by merit, not by wasta, and all of those good things. Internal democracy for students, faculty governance, academic freedom. Down the list, it's not like I had anyone working in a university would have these same concerns. But in Lebanon, coming out of the civil war, I said, our practices, if they're understood by the rest of society, may have some kind of spillover effect through our students as they go forth into their adult lives and take up roles as parents and husbands and wives and workers and employees, et cetera. What I didn't know at the time was just how important AUB is to Lebanon's economy, to its society as an employer in particular. I think when I came out there, the biggest private sector employer was Middle East Airlines. Then the World Bank engineered a complete overhaul of MEA about 3 years into my presidency, and AUB became the largest private employer in the Lebanese economy, mainly given the huge employment in the hospital, AUH. So I didn't have any idea, or I didn't have much of an idea of how important AUB was to Lebanese society and the economy. That came as something of a shock to me. But there's one anecdote that I've always loved, and it goes back to how I went out in the first place. The State Department did raise its ban on U.S. passport holders residing in Lebanon shortly after I was nominated by the trustees to be president. This was about in June 1997, maybe July 1997. Madeleine Albright made a public statement saying it's okay for American passport holders to go to Lebanon whenever they want and to reside there if they so choose. So I got to Beirut, and I had more than one person who was convinced that it was because of my nomination as president that Madame Albright lifted the ban on U.S. citizens going there. I said, this is a compliment to AUB that they think it has that kind of clout. That was what I heard.
I hope you didn't correct them.
No, I didn't. I know. The longer you believe that, the better.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to jump to this quote, which is from the book. I'm going to read it for those of you who can't see it. This comes after a long list of policy prescriptions and recommendations that are possible. And I think this underscores the pragmatism that you use to approach this book. You say, some really bad guys, parentheses, at the time of writing, there are no female heads of state in the Middle East and North Africa, could survive all of these reforms, but citizens and society would benefit. And what you're suggesting is even some really bad guys could survive these reforms. And so I guess I want to ask you, did you approach this book, are there policy reforms that you are sort of left on the table because they're too disruptive, even though from your standpoint, they would completely help these missions impossible?
Yeah, I would be very surprised, although I don't rule it out, that universities as entities, as administrative and educational entities, would be given full authority over their basic internal affairs. I'd be very surprised if we saw that in the Arab world. We may see it for one or two exceptions, maybe something like KAUST in Saudi Arabia, the King Abdullah University of Science and Technology, which has its own endowment, huge endowment. I think initially it was worth something like $10 billion. I don't know what it's like today, but given market conditions, it's probably 30, 40 billion. And so it's got the financial wherewithal to be completely autonomous. It's hired its presidents from outside of Saudi Arabia since its inception some 20 years or 25 years ago. It's had all non-Saudi presidents. It has control over what it teaches, over its curriculum and its main offerings, but it is science and technology, STEM disciplines, but it has control over its course offerings and content. And I believe it has control over its admissions. It can decide what students to accept and what students not to accept. These are the kinds of decision-making authorities that are very rarely found in Arab public universities. And I think most Arab leaders would be very reluctant to grant to their universities. I'd be surprised if we saw that implemented other than in one or two highly specialized or kind of flagship universities that are being set up in the non-oil exporting states.
So of this list, there are 2 pages worth of recommendations and possible reforms. Of this list, are there any that jump out that you think these are a gimme, these are a layup? Why are these not happening?
Yeah, there's one, and it applies to the Arab world, but it applies anywhere. I would argue what I'm going to say now, I would argue for the United States as well as I would for Egypt or Morocco or Lebanon. And that's the issue of university dropouts. It's a plague everywhere in the world. I think I mentioned in the book that Argentina, of all places, has probably the highest university dropout rate of any country in the world. Very few Argentinians who begin university actually complete their course of study and get diplomas. It's a big problem in the Arab world. I don't think it's bigger than elsewhere. There aren't a lot of reliable or even official statistics on dropout rates, but they probably are in the range of 30 to 40%, particularly after the first year. And I could go into the reasons why after the first year, but it doesn't really matter. It means that thousands, tens of thousands of students in whom there's already been a big investment to get them through secondary school, through their baccalaureate exams and into university, and then put 1 year of investment into them in university and then watch them leave. And it turns out that 1 year of university education isn't enough to give you any particular advantage in the job market. So unemployment rates among dropouts are just as high or even higher than they might be for those who complete university education. So the state is already investing in these people. They already accept them into existing institutions. It's not like we wouldn't have educated them otherwise. We were committed to educating them and they dropped out. Not only that, you may hire staff in anticipation of these students staying, and then they leave after the first year, 30, 40%. And you've got the staff still lined up ready to teach them. So either you bring in other students somehow, maybe from abroad, which a lot of Arab universities are trying to do to fill the ranks, or you dismiss these usually contract teachers, adjuncts, as we call them in the US, and send them home. You know, you hire them 1 semester at a time. They don't get any of the benefits package that the university offers its full-time employees. They teach by the course, they're paid by the course, and if you don't need them the following semester, bye-bye.
So it
seems hugely wasteful to me.
So in the American context, I understand why, as a former high school teacher, I very intimately understand why students drop out of colleges in the States. Usually they're ill-prepared, they're predatory universities that have incentives to take on federal grant money, and then students drop out with the bag of loans in hand. In the Arab context, why are students dropping out, and what policy prescriptions could help sort of tide that trend?
Yeah, I think there's two big reasons in many Arab countries. One is that while higher education may be free, the actual coursework may be free, there are a lot of ancillary expenses. You may live in Sohag in Egypt and be admitted to Cairo University. You got to figure out how to pay for your lodgings in Cairo. You may have to figure out how to pay for some of your meals, not all of them. There'll usually be at least one meal at the university cafeteria, but otherwise you got to pay for your meals, your public transport, your books, and sometimes lecture notes. And when you add them all up, and this is why it happens in the first year, the kid looks and says, I can't do it. Getting in the full restaurant, and they're not hiring. So I can't even supplement what my non-income to pay for these ancillary expenses. So there's finances that will drive them out. Sometimes they want to major in a major that requires mastery of a foreign language, French or English, generally English. And they don't have that mastery, so they don't get the major they want, and they drop out because they don't want to do commerce or Islamic studies or even law. So they've gone. And it'd be a different set of drivers in a country like the United States, but usually financial is going to explain it. And then sort of in the same vein, they may have been hoping to transfer from one faculty to another after the first year, but their grades aren't good enough and they're denied the transfer. And so they drop out because it's not what they wanted.
So in the US, some of the prescriptions are this emphasis on job training programs, online programs, community college, vocational schools, and trying to get, in particular, students from low-income communities to get into other career track pathways, educational pathways. Do you see that as a viable, possible solution or, an option in the Arab world as well, or not so much?
Well, every Arab country has some kind of vocational training and vocational institutions, which I suppose are the rough equivalent of our junior colleges and community colleges in the United States. But there, I do think the general lament about quality is dead on. I can't think of a single Arab country that can really boast a good vocational education system. So that track, it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. They have low quality, poor reputation, so nobody wants to go into them. Students fight to avoid being forced into them. So those that are forced into them turn out to be, I hate to use the term, losers in some sense. And so they perpetuate the reputation of low quality and low skill transfer. So there is an area, seeing as they have a vocational education system, why not try to improve it? There are lots of good models. I mean, it could be Singapore, it could be the Scandinavian countries, it could be Germany above all, I think, where there's been huge experience and a great deal of success. Some of those lessons could be transferred, it would seem to me, to the Arab world. Another area that I speculate about very briefly in the book, I wish I knew more about it, is using the armed forces for vocational training, which has been done successfully in many other societies, but really making it part of the mission of the armed forces to transfer skills to their conscripts so that when they get out, they've got a viable skill that they can market and gain employment through.
Yeah. Okay, my last question before we go to the quick Q&A is, who do you suspect will be the agents for change? Who are the likely actors? There are people who are benefiting from the current system. Which actors do you think will be motivated to push these changes forward in just the right level of disruption, where it's not overly disruptive, where they hit roadblocks, but they're able to make progress? Who are the most likely sort of sectors of the economy or members of the political sort of policy class?
Right. Well, this is where I encountered a surprise in my own research. I was expecting to find that distance or virtual learning, distance learning would be the big disruptive innovator because it could deliver a decent product at a fraction of the cost of a bricks and mortar university. And I thought just in cost terms, this might be the train coming through the tunnel that would blast out the old traditional universities. I don't think so now. I mean, it may have some of that impact, but not as much as I thought. What I think may be the disruptor, and it can be accommodated, is the private sector, which is growing rapidly in most Arab societies. And it has been granted a very different set of governance principles than public institutions. Most private institutions do enjoy a fair amount of autonomy. They are able to control a lot of the elements I mentioned with respect to KAUST in Saudi Arabia, over curriculum and missions and promoting and hiring, et cetera. And where I think it may be disruptive in a non-destructive way is that I can't imagine public institutions sitting around watching the private sector enjoy these rights and possibilities without being granted the same authorities, the same level of autonomy. I haven't seen a lot of evidence of that yet, but let's say if Arab countries are looking at China as an exemplar, the Chinese have said they want 20 of their universities in the top 100 within the next 15 years or something like that. I mean, this is what university autonomy is designed to do, help universities compete with one another. And China is jumping in with both feet, and this is a highly autocratic, party-dominated, high-control system, and it's pushing individual universities to move ahead. We could see something like that moving into the Arab world.
Okay, great. I'm going to do this quick Q&A and then we'll open up for questions real quick. And I should say that, John, I hope that we're able to have you back at some point because there's so much other stuff to talk about outside of this book. So
be happy to do it.
All right, so the first question, what are you reading or watching right now?
Yeah, I think I mentioned to you before we went on that I'm teaching a group of seniors in the sense of older people, a course on democratization in the Middle East. So I've been going through all of the literature on what is sometimes called Arab exceptionalism or the Arab democracy deficit, and why one would expect to see more democracy in societies like Arab societies than we actually do. And there's a ton of literature. All I can say is that it's full of contradictions and no consensus. So I don't have an easy message to give to my students, yeah. But that's sort of where my reading is headed right now.
Is there a book that somebody, if we want to point in a specific direction, is there a book that sort of is at the top of mind?
Oh, that's a good question. There's a general book, not on the Arab world. There's a ton on the Arab world, but they generally tend to be edited collections rather than an integrated book. So Carnegie has put out stuff, the Democracy Institute has put out stuff, and they're usually collections that tend to be country focused. So you have a chapter on Egypt and a chapter on Jordan and a chapter on Algeria, et cetera. So from that point of view, they're not well integrated. There's a guy named John TRL, Jan-TRL, who has done a book on democratic transitions, which I think is terrific. I don't have it sitting here, okay. Otherwise I could give you the exact title. But it's a really fine synthetic analysis, which touches fairly often on the Arab world, but isn't focused on the Arab world.
Okay, great. I'm going to go through these pretty quickly. So who would you love to shadow for a day, past or present?
Wow. I would say any Arab head of state, because I've watched them at a distance for so long. I've never tracked them up close. I'd love to be trailing along, you name it, any of them.
Okay.
And there is now a female Arab head of state, at least prime minister level in Tunisia. So my earlier observation doesn't quite hold.
Thankfully, it doesn't. So what do people most misunderstand about your work?
I don't know. I think I'm pretty simple in my writing and propositions, so it's not going to be confusion that overwhelms people. But they're always very complex situations, and as with the democracy deficit in the Middle East, there never seems to be a single explanatory variable that to the answer. There's always a lot of on the one hand and on the other hand. I think people understand that, but may find it frustrating that I can't come out and say, yep, this is exactly the cause of the democracy deficit in the Arab world. If we can just concentrate on this one variable, we'll be able to solve the puzzle, because that's just not the way it works out. And I think most of my writing, I probably start because there's a big puzzle. And then when I get into it, I find out there's good reason for a big puzzle. It's really complex, and it's hard to nail down causality.
Yeah. Okay, last one. Whose work do you admire or are inspired by? I'm sure the list is long, but if there is one person that comes to mind.
Yeah, and it may be someone none of you have heard of, but it's a guy who I think should have won the Nobel Prize for economics. His name is Mancur Olson, and he wrote a book on the theory of collective action. And it was one that inspired a lot of work I did when I studied the sharing of water in the Nile Basin among 13 different sovereign nations. It's the same issue you'd find in the Colorado basins among US states and Mexico, in any long river that goes across boundaries. And Mancur Olson had a whole theory on how collective action comes about among sovereign entities that aren't obliged to cooperate. And I found his work absolutely brilliant, very simple, very clear, and I applied it pretty extensively to my work on the Nile.
Great. Okay, thanks for that. So we have 3 questions. The first one comes from LM. If you want to unmute yourself.
Sure, thanks for the opportunity.
And if you can just choose one of your questions, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. My question is fairly quick, but given the current circumstances in Lebanon, and then the fact that you mentioned your tenure when you first came to AUB, I think that was post the Civil War, and you mentioned that there was a bit of internal strife at the university. And I wanted to essentially ask you, how did you go about resolving that or amending the internal strife within the faculty or at the university the university environment overall to minimize the disruption of the learning experience, given that the outer environment was rather precarious?
I don't think I had a strategy focused like a laser on that issue, but a couple of things certainly alleviated the problem. One was to be as forward-looking as possible and not dwell on the past, try to move past the issues that had arisen. I'm not sure if you're an AUB graduate or not, but if you know AUB, you'll know that we had a campus in the eastern Beirut called the off-campus program, which was highly controversial. It catered to the Christian students of East Beirut who found it too difficult to go across the Green Line and into West Beirut. So a lot of stuff revolved around the animosities kicked up during the existence of the off-campus program. I wanted to look steadfastly forward, and 2 things happened pretty early on. We got a set of academic advisors and visitors funded by the Ford Foundation in Cairo to come out to AUB to review all of our programs, departments, programs of study, and make recommendations to us on how to improve what we were doing and move ahead. And I think that had a tremendously positive impact on the faculty. They were engaging. We had 4 Nobel laureates among the 30 people who came to visit. And these were really top flight academics from Europe and North America. And our faculty were re-engaging after so many years of being somewhat isolated and off anybody's radar. Here they were talking to the real leaders in their fields, interchanging with them and getting some ideas on how to move forward. And that went straight into a big academic planning effort, which again, focused us on the future rather than dwelling on past problems. The second big change was we began hiring faculty in fairly large numbers. This had already happened in the hospital and in the Faculty of Medicine, but it spread to other faculties so that there was suddenly a big injection of new academic blood. Many of the people who came were of Lebanese extraction, no surprise there, but they had been abroad for a long time or even born abroad, and they brought a new set of attitudes and a new outlook, which kind of shook the place up and again had us looking forward because they were quite demanding. They wanted to see a lot of changes, and so we got focused on changing and moving forward, and some of the old problems began to subside. I can't say they ever went away fully, but they lost some of their edge.
Great. I'm going to ask Leila's question on her behalf just because we're running out of time. Leila, do you mind if I ask it?
No, please do.
So
Please
the question is, thanks, Leila. The question is, how do you see the future of education in Lebanon, seeing that the 3 main pillars of the Lebanese economy, banking, health, and education, are gradually falling apart? Do you see any issue or hope or pathway forward?
I'm hoping to see Lila in New York in some weeks, so maybe I should save my answer. I don't know if I have an answer for that. I can't quite get my head around what's happening in Lebanon right now. It's almost cataclysmic, and so yeah, keeping talent is going to be extraordinarily difficult. Already is difficult. I'm sure AUB is not alone in losing faculty to positions outside the country altogether. For me, the faculty is the guts of any university. If your faculty loses quality and loses its cutting edge, then the university begins to slowly sink. So that's got to be the main challenge, how to keep people. And events like what we've seen in the last 3 or 4 days isn't going to encourage people to stick around. I can't imagine that I wouldn't be figuratively packing my bags if I were a faculty member now in Lebanon. So it's really rough. Well, we saw during the Civil War, and that was part of some of the animosities, that a core group of faculty kind of gutted it out and stayed on board and kept the place going, and were somewhat resentful when other expatriate Lebanese came back and joined the faculty and hadn't paid the price that the resident faculty paid. So we may be in a situation like that, but I think there will always be, I keep looking at the AUB faculty email exchange, and I'm always heartened to see so many familiar names and old friends who are still there, giving us their thoughts by email on various issues facing the university.
Great. I'm going to ask one other question that comes in the chat. It's from, I think, a current Princeton student, Yasmin. She says, do you think Saudi Arabia attempting to become a cultural hub in the region, and I'll slap on an academic hub in the region, like the UAE, will have a positive effect on academic culture, perhaps help reduce the massive brain drain? I know you don't cover the GCC much in the book, but do you have a sense on what sort of secondary and tertiary effects that may have?
I'm not sure. The educational establishments in the oil exporting countries involve relatively small numbers, given what we see in some of the bigger Arab states. I mean, Cairo University probably has 140,000 registered students. At one point, that would have been as much as all of Saudi Arabia's students in higher education. And of course, in the UAE and other Gulf states, the student numbers are even smaller. So I'm not sure whether it's going to have a huge regional impact. And getting an education, if you're an expat going to a Gulf university, they may be equipping you for migration almost better than their own home institutions, because they've invested a huge amount in their educational establishments, and you get very advanced training. So it opens doors that may actually encourage out migration. But the last time I was spending any time in Abu Dhabi, there seemed to be kind of two tracks coming out of the local universities. One track was expat. It was the children of people who worked in the expat community in the Gulf and who might then leave to go to their home countries when they finished their education. And then the local population, which was overwhelmingly recruited into the civil service in whatever country they resided in, with civil service jobs being kind of the expected route to go. I don't think many were drawn into jobs like teaching in high schools or primary schools, but they did go directly to work in the other public bureaucracies. So I don't think there's going to be a big impact on brain drain, which of course now is in a country like Lebanon increasing exponentially.
Okay, great. John, this was a real pleasure to have you on. It's an honor to be able to talk to you about this work, and I hope we can repeat it in the future.
Thanks so much for having me. It was great fun.
Okay, everybody, enjoy your day or night wherever you are, and we will see you next time.